everybody, and you're very welcome to the latest Radio Centre Ireland webinar on the Irish Audio Report. I'm very happy to introduce Karen Hall from Ipsos, and Karen will be going through the details of the audio report, which essentially looks at, what people are listening to in terms of live radio, podcasts, streaming. How are they listening in terms of what device, and where are they listening? Are they listening at home? Are they listening in the car? Are they listening when they're out and about? So we're going to go through lots of detail. I hope you will enjoy the presentation. I'm just going to share my screen now. And what you'll see on screen then is just the, bear with me, the contents. So firstly, I'll go through an introduction, and then Karen is going to go through the other contents that are there on the screen. But before we go into the Irish Audio Report, I think one key stat or one key outtake or insight from the audio report is that there's universal listening. 98% of adults listen to audio content every single week. And really, I'm trying to understand why our audiences continue to grow. There's more people listening and listening for longer, and why is that the case? And what I thought I'd do is kind of to frame that is something I actually, if people were at the Mansion House webinar a couple of weeks ago, I presented this chart, but I just think it's worth repeating again, is to try and frame the reason for the growth in terms of Byron Sharp's framework around how brands or services grow. And the reason brands or services grow is that they have strong both physical availability and mental availability. When it comes to physical availability, what we're looking at from consumers' point of view, how can they get something, when can they receive it, and can they receive it immediately? Can they get their hands on something whenever they want it or whatever they want? And when it comes to physical availability, when it comes to audio, if you look at what's happened over the last number of years, with the increase in the devices that you can use to connect to audio. So if you look at smart speaker penetration back in 2014 was non-existent. It's now in 2023 at 45%. Smartphone penetration is nearly universal at 92%. So what that means is people have instant access to audio. They have a pocket full of audio at arm's reach. So anytime, wherever they are, when they're out and about, be it whatever device, be it smart speaker, smartphone, or other means of connecting with audio, they can do so instantaneously. And that has helped drive audience levels and audience listening over time. The other framework that Byron looks at is mental availability. So what brands or services come to mind at a moment of needs? And again, 2 weeks ago, Radio Centre Ireland launched new research would look exactly at that, at what need states does audio satisfy. And what it shows is that audio satisfies an enormous amount of need states that are relevant to people right throughout the day, from keeping me in the loop, to helping me to escape, to lifting my mood, to keeping me company, to amplifying the moment, to fueling conversations, to broaden my horizon. So what that means is throughout the day, there's a huge amount of moments of need that audio satisfies. And that's the other reason why audio is continuing to grow in terms of people listening and the amount of time people listen. So it's a combination of that physical and that mental availability. And one other thing that piece of research did, it also looked at the role of different formats. And what it actually showed is that live radio and on-demand formats, rather than competing, actually play complementary roles for listeners. So when you look at live radio, that is driven by the need for people to feel energized and uplifted with, specifics, and feel more connected to specific social groups and to the wider world. Podcast listening is about the desire to learn new things and to develop deeper understanding of certain topics. And on-demand music services is really centered around mood management. So you have these different formats, you have fantastic physical availability, you have a fantastic mental availability of audio, and yet you have these formats, on-demand formats and live radio, actually playing a complementary role to increase the overall level of listening rather than competing with each other. So that just gives you kind of an introduction into our context to the Irish Audio Report. And now what I'm going to do is hand over to Karen, who's going to go through the details of the report itself. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Kieran. I'll just share my screen.
And by the way, just to say, if you want to put questions in the Q&A box, we will come to questions at the end of the session.
Thanks, Kieran, and thanks everybody for tuning in today. Hopefully what we have to talk about is going to be of interest to everybody. I just thought I'd start initially to tell you a little bit about what the survey and how we conducted it, just to set the scene as such. So the information we're going to be looking at today is based on a short special module that was conducted in tandem with the core JNLR interview in Q2 this year. So Q2, April, May, and June. It's a special additional short questionnaire asked of the same respondents, about 4 minutes long. So what we have now is therefore a large sample. We've a sample of just over 3,000 individuals. So the data is based on that sample size, which is very solid, very good sample size. And that sample, in the same way as the JNLR sample is conducted, it's spread across all radio franchise areas, across all urban and rural areas, all age groups, all socioeconomic groups and working groups, etc. So keep that in mind. It's a special module conducted in tandem with the core JNLR data. So this first section, what we thought we would do is just have a look at some of the core JNLR metrics that we would normally see. Sorry. Here we go. So just as a little bit of an overview, and this is the data that's currently in the marketplace. It's what was published in August, and it's based on the 12 months data to June 2023. So just really as a reminder and to set the scene a little bit. So we know that 80% of people listen to radio on an average day, and that equates to 3.3 million people listening each day. So radio is in a strong position. Among those listeners are tuning in for more than 4 hours. And remember, we're talking about listeners across all the age groups, across the whole cohort of individuals. And those hours accumulate up to over 13 million hours per day. So these are the normal metrics that we're used to seeing, that a lot of people are used to trading on in terms of the radio market. When we look at specifically at radio reach, we can see that in terms of the proportion of individuals tuning in, the pattern has been really very satisfyingly stable, I suppose, since 2018 at 82%. We're now at 80% of the population tuning into radio each day. In real terms, in terms of actual numbers of individuals, we see that there's an increase now to over 3.3 million people tuning in each day. So, you know, radio has grown in these recent periods. So if we look across the broad spectrum in terms of the various age groups and so on, we can see on the left-hand side, we see the average among those aged 15 plus at 80%. And we can see that the reach ranges from 66.6% among the 15 to 24-year-olds, so the youngest age cohort, up to 87.5% among the older groups, the 65 pluses. So we can see that there's a significant engagement in the media, in the medium across all of the various age groups. One of the other pieces of information that we collect on JNLR, on the core survey, is in terms of the devices used to listen. And while we know that most listening happens to radio on the standard FM radio, more than 500,000, 546,000 people are listening on digital platforms on a typical or average day. And this listening activity delivers 11% share of radio minutes in terms of listening on digital device. So we know that radio, that the AM FM radio in the home or in the car is still the primary device, but in terms of share of minutes, 11.4% of minutes are listened on a digital device. Slightly different picture if we look at the right-hand side of the chart here. Among the 15 to 34-year-olds, more listening happens on a digital device, and we'll see more about that later on as we go through the charts for the specific audio module. And in terms of share of minutes, digital devices have a share of 21.2% among the 15 to 34-year-olds. So that kind of gives us a snapshot of the pieces of information that are currently in the marketplace since August of this year. So in terms of the specific audio module, we begin that interview by asking people, about the types of technology that they own or have access to. And we can see here that, Irish audiences are connected, are very highly connected. 91% have broadband access, which is almost universal. And 92%, as Kieran mentioned earlier, own a smart speaker. And these ownership levels have been, they've been reasonably high for the last number of years. Then when we look at tech, voice activated tech or smart speakers, the current level of ownership is at 45%. And this has grown significantly over the number of years. In 2019, it was 13%. So it is a significant jump to its current position. And we know when we look at the information on ownership of smart speakers, for example, that it is higher among the younger groups. It ranges from 59% among those aged 15 to 24, over to 15% among the 65 plus age group. But it is creeping across the age cohorts as such. And in fact, compared to last year, the biggest growth in terms of ownership is among the 45 to 64 age group. So it is becoming more and more of a thing across all age groups. We introduced a new question into the survey this time. We asked people, do they own Bluetooth-enabled wireless headphones? And 52% of the population, of the 15 plus population, say that they do. And again, there's higher levels of ownership among the younger markets. It ranges from 78% among the 15 to 24 group to 14% among those aged 65 plus. Another question we introduced this time around was in relation to subscriptions to some of the online platforms for audio content. And this is quite an interesting one. If we look at the numbers underneath the logos there, we can see that 33% of all those age 15 plus have a paid subscription, ad-free in other words, to an audio streaming service such as Spotify Premium. 13% have a paid subscription to YouTube Premium, and 11% have a paid subscription to a podcast or some podcasts. When we do a net figure across all of that, we can understand that almost 2 in 5, or 38% of the universe are of this particular Irish audience are subscribing to one or other of these online platforms for audio content. So quite a sizable chunk of people are paying subscriptions for their audio content and to achieve that ad-free service. Again, when we see, as we've seen on some of the other patterns of ownership and so on, younger people are more likely to pay for audio content. We can see here, looking at the left-hand side, first of all, if we look at the paid subscription figures, we saw the average of 33% among all 15 plus. Among 15 to 24-year-olds, 54% of that group are paying a subscription to an audio streaming service such as Spotify Premium. 43% of the 25 to 44-year-olds are paying, and 21% of those aged 45 plus are paying for audio streaming service. Moving across then to the middle band here, in terms of the YouTube Premium service, fewer people are paying into it at 13% overall. But again, among the younger groups more than average are paying. So 18% of the 15 to 24-year-olds are paying a subscription for YouTube Premium, 18% of 25 to 44-year-olds as well. And for podcasting, however, the highest level, or slightly higher than the 15 to 24-year group, 16% of those aged 25 to 44-year-olds are paying a subscription for a podcast of some kind. And this kind of supports, I suppose, that the information Kieran talked about there, you know, the reasons people are tuning in, the motivations for tuning into things like podcasts and so on. So we can see the patterns now and the profiles of people who are doing so. So the interview then moves on to looking at the daily environment, the daily audio environment. You know, what devices are being used to consume audio and what locations are being used. Where are people when they are tuning in to their audio content? And in the next few charts, what we're talking about here is any audio, so including all the formats like live radio, personal music, podcast, streaming, listen back, YouTube for music, and so on. So it's addressing all of those formats together. So this is just a summary sheet here. We can see most audio activity happens at home. 69% of people are tuning in on an average day to audio at home. But 41% are listening to audio in the car. So quite a significant proportion of people are tuning in to listen to audio when out and about in their car. In terms of the device, the key devices used is the radio, or the CD player, the music system that people have, or their record player for their vinyl collection, and so on. So that's the standard kind of music system, and the majority of people are still using those systems to tune into audio. But technology does feature in this space. 30% are using a smartphone to listen on an average day. I'll look at those in a little bit more detail here. So we, as I said, the radio or the stereo system, music system, remains the most used device among listeners, but there are significant proportions using a connected device. If we look from the left to the right, we see the 70% using the radio or music system, 30% used a smartphone, 10% used a smart speaker, 7% used a PC laptop, 3% a tablet, 3% a TV, and 3% an other system. And we're talking here about the average day, the daily kind of use of these types of devices. We know that in terms of the smartphone, that will be the key device among audiences of on-demand radio, and we can see that a little bit further on. And we know then that in terms of, there has been a little bit of a little shift in terms of trend on this particular chart. So smart speaker, it has been increasing a little incrementally each year. It's increased from 6% in 2021 to 10% this year. So if we look at the various age groups that we focus on for this particular study, we can see that the smartphone is the most used device among the younger 15 to 24 groups. So if we look at the second column there, among 15 to 24-year-olds, 49% of that group used a radio or music system to listen. So it's lower than the average figure of 70, obviously, there. But 60% of this group used a smartphone to listen. 11% used a smart speaker, pretty much on par with the average, 9% a PC, 2% a tablet, and 3% used the TV. And when we move over to the next age group, the 25 to 44-year-olds, among this group, still the biggest proportion are using the standard FM radio, for example, or music system, but 36% of this group are using a smartphone to listen on an average day, and 12% are using the smart speaker. When we look at the older group, the main, while there is use of technology across that age group, the main device used to listen is the radio or the standard music system. So where are people when they are listening to their audio material? We can see that the majority are listening at home. Most audio is consumed at home. 69% of people are listening there. 41% are listening in the car, 11% at work, school, or college, 11% when out and about, out walking or cycling or running, and 3% when on the bus, train, or the DART. We have seen some changes in this when we look at the short trend, even back to 2021. If you remember, 2021 was that year when we were very restricted. We were in lockdown for part of the year. And even when we weren't in lockdown, our movements were restricted. And we can see that back in 2021, listenership at home was at 75%. And now it's changed and come down to 69%. And equally, in 2021, the listenership in car was at 34%, and now it's increased to 41%. Small increases for at work, school, and college from 9 to 11, out walking and cycling from 8 to 11, and on the bus and train from 1 to 3%. So certainly, as we've been out, as now life, I suppose, is becoming is renormalized a little bit. We're moving around in a more normal fashion than we were able to in those years. And the figures are reflecting that. Also, a couple of other things to mention here, that live radio is the biggest format in the car environment. As I say, we can see 41% are tuning into in the car, and live radio is the biggest format in that environment. In terms of that in-car listening, it does peak marginally among those people who are in employment. So half of those people who are employed listen to audio content in the car or their van on an average day, and 16% of that group listen when they're at work or college. So that kind of makes sense, I suppose, probably to most of us. You know, as we're commuting around and about for our work and so on, you know, we have access to audio, or we want access to audio. So it certainly does peak in those scenarios. Keep in mind as well that there's 58% of the 15 plus population in employment, and about 50% of those are full-time. So it isn't everybody out there that is going out and about to work, but a significant proportion of people are. When we look in terms of the audio activity by age groups, you know, in terms of that location, again, we see, you know, that most listening, as we saw, happens in the home. And that's the same across all age groups, you know, across 15 to 24s, 25 to 44s, and 45 pluses. But younger groups are more engaged with audio outside of the home compared to the average. So if we look at the 15 to 24 age group there, we can see that while 63%, the majority, the largest proportion said they listen to audio at home, 23% of this age group listen when they're out walking or cycling or running, and 11% are listening when they're on the bus or train. So significantly higher for both of those instances than the average among all 15 plus. And when we look to the next age group, the 25 to 44-year-olds, we see that a higher than average proportion of that group are listening in the car. 48% of this group listen in the car on an average day, and 16% listen at work or school or college in an average day. So certainly the younger age groups are more engaged with audio outside of the home compared to the older cohorts. Just to, again, by way of context as well, and an interesting statistic, I suppose, for everybody, to keep in mind that almost a third of those people in employment work from home at least one day a week. And almost half of working graduates work from home on one day a week. So there are a proportion of workers, the workforce, who have the facility or are able to, or their job allows them to work from home. And that keep that in mind, I suppose, as we're looking at the types of consumption patterns, etc., as we're looking through this this report. So the next section then looks at the reach of the various audio formats, you know, what proportion of people were listening to the various different types of audio that we measured. And again, just as by way of a summary, we can see that 89% of the 15 plus population are active in the audio market on an average day. And that equates to 3.7 million active listeners. So a large proportion of people are tuning into audio content on their typical day. And this increases to almost universal listening. 97.6% of people are listening to audio in the past week. So a huge weekly reach there for audio content. It is an innovative sector, it's a growing sector, but live radio is the dominant format in this sector. And when we look at past week or weekly reach in this regard, almost 92% have listened to live radio in the past week. That compares to 57.4% who listened to some on-demand online audio in the past week, so such as podcasts or streaming or YouTube, for example. So it is it's a very satisfying number to see the number of the sheer numbers of people engaged in the audio in the audio market at all on a typical week. So as we saw, 92% are listening to live radio in the past week. 40% listen to music streaming. 34% listen to YouTube for music in the past week. 23% listen to their own music archives, whether that be, you know, their vinyl collection, their downloads, their CDs, for those of us who still have them. 22% have listened to a podcast, whether that's an Irish podcast or an international one, and 7% listen back to Irish radio. In terms of the patterns of listening or the short trends, it's a reasonably steady picture compared to last year. There has been a slight increase. I'll move on to the next chart. It's a reasonably steady pattern, but a slight increase in terms of own music listening. It's kind of bounced back a little bit, more in line with 2021 figures, the current figure here at 23%. If we look at if we start at the top again and look at live radio there, we can see the trend is very steady from 93% in 2019 to 92% now in 2023. If we look at music streaming, we saw in the early years from 2019 and 2021 to 2022, significant growth there in music streaming, now at 40%, and still and that remains consistent with last year's figures. YouTube for music, again, has been reasonably consistent across all of the years that we've been measuring it. 36% in 2019, 35% last year, 34% this year. Own music then, in 2019, 36% of people were tuning into their own music archives in the past week. And this has dropped steadily over the years. But as I said, this year, there's been a slight jump back. So we could see, even looking at that range of that number, it really just shows that our methods of accessing our own audio, our own personal music, has changed. Previously, we would have been using our CDs and so on, and downloads ourselves. Music streaming has kind of taken over to a great degree from that activity. So music streaming hasn't necessarily affected. It hasn't affected radio as such. It has really affected that way we're tuning into our own music. We see the pattern for listening back to radio has been pretty steady as well over this trended period. But we do see for podcasts, whether that's an international or Irish podcast, we see the growth there from 9% in 2019 through to 22% now. So the levels to digital formats are broadly similar to 2022, even though we see and we do see that small resurgence in listening to our own personal music. If you look at the various age groups, the pattern of listening was very steady among those aged 25 years and over. But in fact, among the younger group, the younger 15 to 24-year-olds, we see fewer people tuning in the past week to the online digital audio, to the music streaming, to YouTube for music. So there has been a slight change among those younger groups. So here's a bit more detail in terms of those age formats. And this is the current year, the current patterns of listening. The first column shows the 15 plus figures. So we can see, for example, with live radio, in the past week, 92% is the average. Among those 15 to 24-year-olds, 87% are tuning into live radio in the past week. And that, when we look across the age groups, that increases to 95% among the older 65 plus group. In terms of listen back, again, slightly higher listening levels among the younger groups compared to the older 65 pluses. If we look at music streaming, this is where I suppose the biggest differences are apparent. Among the 15 to 24-year-old group, 74% of this group have tuned into music streaming in the past week. 52% of the 25 to 44-year-olds have tuned into music streaming. And then it drops somewhat among the 45 to 64-year-olds. 30% of this group have tuned in, and only very few of the 65 plus are listening in the past week to music streaming. YouTube for music, a kind of similar pattern. The biggest audience there comes from the 15 to 24-year-old group. Over half of these have tuned into YouTube for music in the past week. And 44% of the 25 to 44-year groups have tuned in the past week. Own music, again, again, slightly higher than average among those younger groups. And interestingly, when we look at the podcasts, if we take that any podcast line, on average, 22% have tuned in the past week, slightly higher among the 15 to 24-year-olds at 25%, but higher again among those aged 25 to 44. Almost a third of this group are tuning into podcasts in the past week. So quite an interesting figure there. So if we look at the profile of some of those listeners in terms of the types of subscriptions they might have. So we've picked out here, it's still past week listening to audio streaming. We saw 40% of people tuned in the past week. But if you remember, we asked that question, do you pay a subscription to audio streaming or not? And do you pay a subscription to podcasts and YouTube and so on? We asked that question earlier on in the interview. And now we can see the profile of those audio streaming listeners. 2/3 of audio streaming listeners have a paid subscription for audio streaming. In other words, it's an ad-free subscription. 28% of podcast listeners have subscribed to or do subscribe to one or other podcast. And 25% of YouTube listeners do subscribe to YouTube Premium. So a significant proportion of people are, of audio streamers particularly, are paid up subscribers. If we look at if we focus in on the 15 to 24-year-olds, there's a similar profile here when we look at the audio streaming listeners, podcast listeners, and YouTube listeners. There are some small sample sizes here, but it's broadly the same pattern as we saw in the earlier chart. In this case, 65% of audio streaming listeners of audio streaming 15 to 24-year-old listeners have a paid subscription, and almost a quarter in terms of podcast listeners and YouTube listeners have a paid for subscription as well. So if we look, so what we've seen there is the weekly pattern, the patterns, how people are consuming audio in the past week. So now we're going to look at the daily pattern. These are the kind of metrics that we typically use in JNLR. So we can see here that across all formats, radio is still the #1 choice by a significant margin. On the left-hand side of this chart, we can see the ANY 15+ market. So we see on a daily basis, on an average day, the reach to live radio is 79%. And on an average day, the reach to music streaming, 24%, to YouTube for music, 17%, to own music, 10%, to podcasts, 8%, and to listen back, 2%. So live radio, there is a significant gap there in terms of daily consumption of this type of audio content. If we move to the right-hand side of the chart, this is the pattern among the young 15 to 24-year group. I suppose we picked this group out because they're almost like the harbingers of change, if you like, in terms of this type of activity in using devices and using the other types of formats and so on. So we see here that among this group, 64% of this group listen to live radio on an average day. 49% listen to a music streaming service like Spotify or similar. 29% are listening to YouTube for music. 19% to their own music, and 9% to podcasting, and 2% to listen back. So the kind of, again, a similar style or pattern to what we saw in terms of the weekly reach. So the interview then moves on to ask people for an estimate of time spent on each of the various audio formats. And from that question, we can determine this share of audio on an average day. So what we can see here, we've all the various formats broken out, and we can see here that in terms of those minutes, live radio has a share of almost 74% of all minutes listened. This compares to music streaming. It's 11.6%, 9.1% share to music streaming paid, and 2.5% to music streaming free. Own music has a 4.3% share. Listen back to radio has a 0.4% share of minutes. And podcast has a 3.2% share of minutes. YouTube for music, when we combine those two, it's got a 6.7% share. But when we look at the paid premium versus free, paid premium has a 2.4% share and free is 4.3% share. So live radio accounts for the majority of time spent in the daily audio market. Again, we zoom in on the 15 to 24-year-old market, and we can see that the share of listening to live radio is 44.7% among. This compares to 28.5% for streaming. And when we look at that in terms of paid streaming and free, it's 22.3% for paid streaming and 6.2% for streaming free. Own music, our own personal archives, has a 10.2% share among the 15 to 24 group. Listen back has a 0.6% share. Podcast a 3.4% share. YouTube Music for paid premium has a 5.4% share, and YouTube Free, if you like, has a 7.3% share. So we had seen earlier that, you know, there's higher engagement among this group in terms of the broader audio market outside of live radio than average, and that is reflected here in the share. But live radio has the biggest share in terms of all of those formats. We can see here sorry, I'm just trying to move on my charts. The analysis in terms of the various age groups that we have been looking at. So again, the first column is what we've seen already, the overall market for age 15 plus. Among the 15 to 24s, we had seen that. We saw the higher than average share for music streaming, for example, and for YouTube for music and so on. And when we look across the age groups, we can see how their patterns of listening in terms of time spent falls out. Let's take the 25 to 44-year-olds. The majority share goes to live radio. The music streaming has a share of 15.5%, YouTube for music 10.2%, own music 4.3%, and any podcast at all is almost 5% at 4.8%. So the share to live radio has dropped marginally since last year. It's down by 0.4%, and the share for other formats has rebalanced a little bit, but in mostly to make room for that little resurgence that we saw to own music. It's now at 4.3% share, where previously it was lower. It was a lower share than that. If we were to do a particular analysis that looked at that time spent again, but excluded the items where just focused on commercial audio, I suppose, where an ad can be placed, for example. So we've looked at that analysis again and excluded items such as own music because we can't place an ad there. We've removed items, for example, the music streaming, the paid for subscription minutes have been removed and the YouTube subscription minutes have removed. And what we're left with is a pool of minutes where an ad can be placed. So we're calling this a share of commercial audio. And we can see when we do that and look at the total population, almost 88% share of these commercial audio minutes goes to live radio. 2.9% goes to music streaming, which is the free or the free version, 0.4% to listen back to Irish radio, 3.7% to podcasts, and 5.1% to YouTube music. So when we focus on just the commercial audio capacity, I suppose, we can see that share for live radio increases to almost 88% there. We did the same analysis among the 15 to 24 age groups, again, by just focusing on the audio where an ad can be placed. And we can see in this instance that the share for live radio has increased to almost 72%. To music streaming, the share is now 10%, listen back 0.9%. To a podcast, the share is 5.4%. And to YouTube for music, which will be the free version, it's 11.7%. So live radio, we saw when we looked at the share of ears across the total audio picture, it had the biggest share proportion. And then when we look at the commercial audio, we see it has bumped up to some degree as well. So that's really the main range of charts I have. I just have a couple of summary points just as reminder points. So we see that between the ongoing strength of live radio and innovation within the on-demand audio is in such a strong position and has never been in such a strong position. So that's all good news. In terms of recency of listening, there's almost universal listening to audio content in the past week at almost 98% there. And live radio we saw as the dominant player in this field, reaching almost 92% of adults. Listening to on-demand online audio now reaches 57.4% of the population. We know that Irish audiences are very connected to digital devices and so on. Ownership of smartphones is now at 92% and smart speakers at 45%. And as Kieran mentioned earlier, this enables easy access to audio content at home or anywhere. And the growth in that ownership of smart speakers, I think we'll continue to see it grow, but it has been relatively rapid, plus 32 points since 2019 when we began to measure it. We saw that most listening to audio content happens at home, with 7 in 10 listening to audio content at home on an average day. And as we saw, as the country moves back outside of the home, there has been some increasing increase in listening outside. 41% are listening in the car. That increased compared to 2021. 11% are listening to audio while out walking and cycling and running. And on an average day, on a typical day, in terms of the time spent listening to audio, live radio has a share of almost 74% of the audio market, while on-demand audio has a 26.1% share. Among the younger 15 to 24-year-old cohort, live radio achieves the largest share of time spent, 44.7%, followed by music streaming. Spotify are similar at 28.5%, and YouTube for music at 12.7%. And almost 2 in 5 adults pay for a subscription service on one or more online platforms, whether that's audio streaming for ad-free, whether it's YouTube Premium for ad-free, or whether it's podcasts. So a significant proportion of people are buying or paying for subscriptions to these type of services. So that's broadly the content that we wanted to share with you today. I hope you found it interesting. I know if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and Kieran will gather those. And thank you for your time.
Many thanks, Karen. Lots of really, really interesting data there. It's very interesting to see for the first time. It's the first time we've measured subscription paid versus free. And I know we always measured, people listening to streaming services or ownership, but we never broke out paid for and free before. I think it's the first time, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think that is interesting to see that number, and hopefully then, it's something that we'd be able to trend in the future if we include that question again, which I think will be a useful one to have in the future. Yeah. So we'll see how that changes over time, or if it changes.
Just to let everybody know, the recording of the webinar and the slide deck will be available on the website later this afternoon. And there is some appendices in the deck as well, which go through some further data as well. But there is some questions, Karen. It's going to go through a few questions that we have. The first question is it possible to share the wording of the question when it comes to digital versus AM, FM device? What is the actual wording that ensures people answer that question correctly?
Yeah, no problem. The way the sequence of the question and the interview, we initially asked people, when did you last do any of the following in terms of listening to live radio, listening to an Irish podcast, and so on. We then moved on and asked them, well, about how much time did you spend listening on each of those? And then we asked, when you listened yesterday, what device did you use to listen? And it was they could mention more than one device, because many people will use more than one device. And this is a face-to-face interview, so they had a show card, and on that show card we could see the various devices listed, whether that was a radio or a CD player, etc., whether it was a PC, laptop, a mobile or smartphone, a tablet device, a TV set. So that was the question. Still thinking about yesterday, what device did you use to listen to, for example, live radio? And we gave a show card with the answer options there, which included the various devices.
Great.
Does that answer that question?
Yes. If it doesn't, if the person wants to type in a follow-up question, very happy to answer that as well. Second was just more a comment. It'd be great if to see the question asked on each slide throughout the deck. I don't know if we could have an additional. We could add that to the presentation, where at the bottom of the chart there's the question that relates to the data. Yeah, we can do that. Right. Another question, Karen, is there a figure for people who are not listening to any radio, but who are listening to other digital audio?
I would have to do an analysis to get that figure. I haven't got that figure at the moment, but I can certainly try. Find that figure. I think though, given the reach of live radio, especially at a weekly level, it's over 9 and 10 people. So most of those, and so most people are listening to radio on a weekly basis. So very few are going to be listening to only to to an other type of format. So, but I don't have that figure at the moment.
And is that figure, because say like daily is 90, just nearly 90% is daily live radio. Is it possible within the survey to see if on a daily basis there is people listening to digital audio but not live radio?
It would require a special analysis to do that, but it is possible. But I would expect it's small, because as we see, the reach of live radio is so large, it almost encompasses everyone anyway. So to have a sole listener to other audio would be small, I think. But I can certainly get that done. There might be a little bit of a delay before I can get it, but I will come forward. If whoever that is maybe lets me know, if you get that person's name, Kieran, I might be able to send it on to them when I have that.
Yeah, I'm not sure who it is, but if that person wants to send me an email or a message on the secretary, and then I can send that out also. Next question is it possible to look at this data by different audience, that share of minutes? Actually, I think you did show share of minutes for some age groups, didn't you?
We showed it for the age groups. Yeah, there's one chart there that has all of the age groups in there.
I know, Simon, I hope you're keeping well. Simon, if there's a specific cohort or demographic that hasn't been included in the deck, if you want to send me an email, and I can follow up that with you and get that data for you. Next question. The music streaming, Spotify and others, 10% of commercial audio daily. Does this include a subscription, ad-free listening, as well as non-subscription?
On the commercial audio, the minutes we stripped out were among those people who have a paid subscription to Spotify. So that the remaining percent goes to people who are listening to Spotify where they don't have a paid subscription. So the free version, if you like. Does that, or am I misunderstanding the question?
No, I think, and again, Nigel, if you want to ask a follow-up question, please do. I think if you look at the pie chart, because the first pie chart you showed breaks out streaming in terms of paid and free, and then the next pie chart you're removing the paid element from that pie chart and recalculating the share. So the first pie chart that you saw, which is total share of listening, includes, and it's separated, both paid subscription to streaming and free subscription to streaming. And then the second chart removes the paid for to just show the share of audio formats where you can place advertisements. So hopefully that answers that. But please, if you want to send another question or send me an email, and we can follow up with more questions. Yes, I think, Simon, you said that. I think the data that you're looking for was on the second chart, and Nigel seems to be happy with that answer. So if there's any last minute questions we have, I'm just checking the time. We have 5 minutes left. If anybody has one last burning question. If not, we have finished slightly earlier. And just to say, the presentation will be available later on the website, plus the recording of the webinar. And also for people who maybe weren't at the Mansion House event 2 weeks ago, the 3 presentations are available on the website, and the 3 recordings. That's Peter Fields' presentation on advertising effectiveness, the differentology Radio Centre Ireland research on radio and audio need states, and then my own presentation, just summarising the outtakes of the previous presentation. So they're all on the website. There's a summary you can read. You can download the decks, and you can watch the presentations on the website. And similarly with this webinar, it will be available later today in terms of the deck, plus the recording of the webinar. So I think that is it. We've no further questions. So I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy day, and really appreciate it. If you need to follow up with myself or Karen, please send us an email, and we'll very happily come back and answer any of the questions that you may have. Many thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.